The month was November, in the year 1873. The wind coming down from the peaks had an edge to it, a promise of iron and ice that Agnes felt in her teeth. She stood before the town council of Prospect Creek, which was really just one man, Mr. Sterling, sitting behind a heavy oak desk. In her left hand, she held the small, calloused hand of her 7-year-old son, Thomas. In her right, a burlap sack containing not food, not clothes, but a tattered farmer's almanac and a small deerskin pouch of saved seeds. The air in the room was stale with the scent of pipe smoke and self-satisfaction. The cold outside was not cruel, it was simply what cold does. Mr. Sterling looked at her, his face a mask of weary paternalism, the look of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. "The Lord provides for those who have faith, Agnes," he said, his voice as smooth and hard as a river stone. "Not for those who spread panic with old wives' tales. Go find your winter where you see it." In her pocket, her fingers closed around a piece of obsidian she had found weeks ago, near a hidden fissure in the hills. The stone was smooth and dark. And for reasons she could not explain, it was warm. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and what the weather is like today. Agnes had not come to Prospect Creek to be a prophet. She had come with her husband, David, a man with strong hands and a quiet hope that the earth beneath the town held a fortune in silver. It held silver, but it also held collapsing timbers and pockets of bad air. After the mine took David, the town allowed Agnes to stay. It was a particular kind of charity, the kind that feels like a debt. She was given a small, damp room behind the laundry in exchange for mending the torn shirts of the men who had worked alongside her husband. She was a ghost at the edge of their lives, useful but unseen. Her defining habit was not born of defiance, but of loneliness. She began to watch the world with the intensity of someone who has little else to look at. She did not just see the birds, she noted the date the geese flew south, 2 weeks earlier than the year before. She did not just see the squirrels, she saw them hoarding pine cones with a frantic energy that bordered on panic. She noted the way the creek ice formed, not as a clean sheet, but in milky, jagged fingers that crept from the banks weeks ahead of schedule. Her husband had left behind a single book, a worn farmer's almanac from a decade prior. Agnes did not just read it. She argued with it. In the margins, in faint pencil script, she recorded her own observations. "Almanac says first frost October 10th, she wrote. Hard frost on the north slope September 22nd. The pines know." This quiet accumulation of knowledge was, in Prospect Creek, a form of heresy. The town was built on a single, unshakable creed: God was predictable, and the seasons followed his reliable plan. That plan was interpreted and announced by Mr. Sterling, who owned the company store, the land the town was built on, and the certainty of every man who owed him money. His pronouncements on when to plant and when to harvest were scripture. For a penniless widow to suggest, even quietly, that the natural world was telling a different story was not just an error. It was an insult. It undermined the very foundation of their precarious existence. Her questions were never rude, but they were sharp. "Should we be reinforcing the livestock shelters, Mr. Sterling? The wool on the sheep is thicker than I've ever seen. Have you considered an earlier harvest for the corn? The stalks are drying from the top down." Each question was met with a patient, condescending smile. She was a woman, after all. A grieving one. Her mind was surely clouded. The town's spiritual leader, Reverend Miller, tried to guide her back to the fold with gentle counsel. After a Sunday service where he had preached on the bounty of the coming harvest, he took her aside. The church smelled of dust and old wood. "Your worry, Agnes," he said, his voice soft with pity, "is a failure of faith. The harvest is God's business, not yours." He believed he was offering comfort. But what Agnes heard was that her careful attention, the one thing she still possessed, was a sin. Her observation was an act of distrust in God. The breaking point came at the October town meeting. Driven by a certainty that felt less like a belief and more like a physical fact, she stood up. She spoke of the beaver dams, built higher and thicker than anyone could remember. She spoke of the deer, moving down from the high country a month before their time. She presented her almanac, with its spidery notes in the margins, as evidence. Mr. Sterling let her speak. When she was finished, a deep silence filled the room. He chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. He called her a hysterical widow and made a joke about her seeing phantoms in the frost. The men laughed. The women looked down at their hands. A week passed. The sun shone, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The deep cold was there, a persistent ache in the air, but the blizzard she had spoken of did not arrive. Sterling saw his chance. He could not have a voice of doubt in his town, especially not one that might, by some fluke, be proven right. He declared her a fearmonger, a liar who was poisoning the town's morale. She was banished. Given 1 hour to gather her things and her son, and to walk away from the only home she had left. She did not take food. She did not take an extra blanket. She took the seeds. She took the book. And she took her boy. The first day was a lesson in the indifference of the wild. The trail she followed was one she had only seen from a distance, a faint line carved into the side of the hills by deer and elk. It was steep, and the ground was hard as iron. Thomas, small for his age, stumbled often. Agnes did not speak much. Words were an energy she could not afford to waste. All her focus was on the next step, on keeping Thomas's hand in hers, on reading the subtle language of the land that the town had refused to learn. The cold was a living thing. It found the thin spots in her shawl, the worn soles of her boots. By nightfall, they found a shallow overhang of rock, not a cave, but enough to break the relentless wind. They had 1 blanket and the last 2 biscuits from her room. They ate them slowly, chewing each bite until it was a tasteless paste. The biscuit did not warm them. That night, sleep did not come. The cold was too deep. It was a physical weight pressing down on them. Agnes held Thomas against her, trying to give him her own fading warmth, feeling his small body shivering uncontrollably. The sound of his coughing, a dry, ragged bark, echoed in the immense silence of the mountains. Shivering, she knew, was good. It meant the body was still fighting. The danger was when the shivering stopped. The second day, the world had shrunk. Her vision seemed to narrow, the edges blurring into a grey haze. The dizziness started around noon. It came in waves, making the horizon tilt and sway. Several times, she had to stop and drop to her knees, her head between her knees, waiting for the world to steady itself. Thirst became a new tormentor. Their mouths were dry, their lips cracked. They found a creek, but it was frozen solid, a thick sheet of opaque ice. She spent nearly an hour with a sharp rock, chipping away at the surface, her hands growing numb, then aching, then numb again. The hole was barely big enough to dip her cupped hands into. The water was so cold it felt like swallowing fire. It did not quench the thirst so much as it shocked the system. After they drank, she saw that her fingers had gone a dead, waxy white. She could not feel them at all. She knew what it meant. Frostbite. She tucked her hands under her arms, trying to force the blood back into them, a burning, agonizing pain that was better than the absence that had been there before. That night was the worst. They found another shallow shelter, this one littered with the droppings of sheep. The smell was faint, but it was the smell of life, and it gave her a small, irrational comfort. Thomas's cough had settled deep in his chest. He was feverish, his skin hot to the touch despite the freezing air. He whimpered in his sleep, murmuring for his father. Agnes lay beside him, the single blanket a pathetic defense against the cold that was seeping up from the ground itself. And for the first time, she truly considered giving up. She thought of walking back. She pictured herself kneeling before Mr. Sterling, begging for a place on the floor of the laundry room. She could endure his scorn. She could endure the pitying looks of the women. She could endure it all if it meant Thomas would be warm. She thought of the warm oatmeal she used to hate, the lumpy porridge they served on charity. Now, the thought of it was a vision of paradise. She lay in the absolute dark, listening to the wind howl and the rasp of her son's breathing. She closed her eyes and considered whether this was where their story ended. A widow and her son, frozen to death in the wilderness, a footnote to a harsh winter no one believed was coming. Then, something pulled her back. It was not a miracle. It was not a voice from the heavens. It was a problem. Her numb hand, tucked inside her pocket for warmth, brushed against the obsidian stone. It was still warm. Not hot, but holding a distinct, persistent warmth that defied the frozen world around it. The question, which had been a distant curiosity, now became an anchor in the storm of her despair. Why was it warm? Where did that warmth come from? The scientist in her, the quiet observer who filled the margins of the almanac, took over. A warm rock in a frozen landscape was an anomaly. And anomalies demanded explanation. Her mind, which had been shutting down, seized on the puzzle. It was a practical problem that required an immediate, physical solution. She had to get to the place where she had found the stone. The decision was made before her body caught up. Survival was no longer an abstract hope, it was the next step in solving a problem. The next morning, she got to her feet. Every joint screamed in protest. She woke Thomas, forcing a little of the icy water into him. He was weak, but the fever had broken slightly. She knew the way. She had mapped these hills in her mind during her lonely walks. It was another half-day's journey, a stumbling, crawling ordeal. Finally, she saw it, a dense stand of ancient juniper trees, their branches twisted and dark against the grey sky, huddled against a limestone cliff face. It was a place no one would ever look. She pushed through the stiff, fragrant branches. And there it was. Not a grand entrance, but a dark slash in the rock, a fissure no wider than a doorway, half hidden by a tangle of old roots. A faint, almost invisible wisp of vapor curled from the opening, disappearing instantly into the frigid air. She stepped inside. The difference was immediate. The wind was gone. The air was utterly still. It was not warm, not like a room with a fire, but the biting, invasive cold was absent. It was the difference between being outside and inside. She led Thomas further in. The cave sloped gently downward. The air grew warmer with every step. Then she saw it. Along one wall, about 20 feet from the entrance, was a dark, wet seam in the limestone. A geological fault. And from it, a constant, gentle warmth radiated into the cavern. She reached out and placed her palm flat against the rock. It was as warm as a living thing. Below the seam, a tiny trickle of water, clear and clean, emerged from the rock and pooled in a natural stone basin before disappearing into the floor. She knelt and dipped her fingers in it. The water was cool, but not frozen. She tasted it. It was pure, with a faint, mineral tang. She had found it. The land, which the people of Prospect Creek saw as a resource to be plundered, had given her what they would not. Shelter. Warmth. Water. She helped Thomas drink from the pool. He coughed, but his body seemed to relax in the still, temperate air. Agnes did not weep. She did not shout for joy. She slid down to the dusty floor, her back against the wall, and felt a sensation she had no name for. It was not relief. It was recognition. As if she had been walking toward this exact spot her entire life without knowing it. This was right. This was home. The first days were spent in a state of primitive survival. They slept huddled near the warm seam, the stone a constant, reassuring presence against their backs. But Agnes knew this was not enough. They needed fire for cooking, for light, for a defense against the deeper cold that would surely come. The cave was a shelter, but it was not yet a home. The building began slowly, with the deliberate patience of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to build. Her first tool was a flat, sharp-edged piece of shale she found near the creek bed. She spent an entire day grinding one edge against a larger sandstone rock, creating a crude but effective blade. It was not an axe, but it could strip bark and sever small branches. With this shale knife, she fashioned her first necessity, a fireplace. Near the mouth of the cave, she found a natural fissure that snaked up through the ceiling, a perfect chimney. Directly below it, she and Thomas began to gather stones. It was grueling work. Many were too heavy for her to lift alone. She used a long branch as a lever, teaching Thomas how to place smaller rocks as a fulcrum. Together, they rolled and pushed the stones into place, building a low, circular wall. She sealed the gaps with a thick paste of clay and water from the spring. It was not pretty, but it was functional. The first fire she built in it was a momentous occasion. The smoke, instead of filling the cave, drew cleanly up the fissure and disappeared. For the first time in a week, they felt a different kind of warmth, the dancing, active heat of a flame. Food was the next challenge. She used the fibrous inner bark of the juniper trees, soaking it in the spring and twisting it into strong cordage. With it, she made a series of simple snares, placing them along the game trails she had noticed leading to the creek. The first catch was a rabbit. She showed Thomas how to skin it with a shale knife, wasting nothing. The meat went into a cracked cast iron pot she found half buried in the mud on an old, abandoned trail. It had a long fissure down one side and couldn't hold water for long, but it was metal. It was a treasure. She could heat water in it, make a thin stew. The pelt she scraped clean and stretched on a frame of branches to dry. It would become part of a blanket, or a patch for their worn clothes. But her greatest ambition lay in the back of the cave. There, where the geothermal seam warmed the rock, the earthen floor was perpetually damp and soft. It never froze. This, she knew, was the heart of their new world. This was where survival would become life. Using her shale spade, she began to turn the soil. It was dark and rich. She worked for days, clearing stones, breaking up clumps of earth with her bare hands. The space was not large, perhaps 10 feet by 5 feet, but it was a kingdom. When the plot was ready, she opened the deerskin pouch of seed she had carried all this way. It felt like a sacred act. She laid them out, hardy kale, stubborn carrots, quick-growing radishes, and a few precious, carefully saved tomato seeds from her old garden plot. She planted them with a reverence she usually reserved for prayer. The problem was light. The cave mouth faced north, and the weak winter sun barely penetrated the first few feet. Her garden was in near total darkness. For a week, this problem consumed her. She would sit for hours, watching the single beam of pale light that managed to creep in at midday, tracking its slow path across the floor. The solution, when it came, was not an invention, but an observation. While digging for clay, she had found deposits of mica embedded in the limestone walls. The rock was full of it, thin, translucent sheets that flaked off easily. They were like panes of glass forged by the earth. She spent the next 2 weeks painstakingly prying these sheets free. Some were small, no bigger than her hand. A few were as large as a dinner plate. She carried them back to the garden plot. Using lumps of wet clay, she began to build small, angled stands near the mouth of the cave. She set the mica sheets into them, creating an array of crude but effective mirrors. It took days of adjustment, moving them an inch this way, an inch that way, until she had managed to capture the weak sunlight and bounce it, ray by ray, into the dark heart of the cave, directly onto her small patch of earth. In late December, the first true blizzard of the season arrived. It came without warning, a wall of white that erased the world. For 3 days, the snow fell, driven by a howling wind. The entrance to their cave was completely buried. They were sealed in. But inside, they were safe and warm. The fire crackled, the geothermal seam radiated its steady heat, and in the reflected light of the mica panels, something miraculous was happening. The first 2 leaves of a lettuce plant had unfurled. They were pale green, almost white, but they were perfect. Agnes knelt and touched one with the tip of her finger. She looked at Thomas, whose face was illuminated by the firelight. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, she harvested their first crop, a small handful of delicate lettuce leaves and 3 tiny, crimson radishes. She washed them in the spring water. She and Thomas sat on the floor and ate them raw. The sharp, peppery crunch of the radish, the crisp snap of the lettuce leaf in the absolute silence of their stone home, it was the sound of victory. It was more than food. It was proof. Proof that the earth could provide when men would not. Proof that she was not a liar. She had seen the winter, and she had prepared. The blizzard that had trapped them in their sanctuary nearly killed an old trapper named Jedediah. He was a man who lived at the edges, tolerated by the people of Prospect Creek for his furs but never truly part of their community. He was caught in the whiteout while checking his lines and had been wandering for 2 days, half frozen and delirious. He stumbled, by sheer chance, upon the juniper grove, seeking shelter from the wind. He saw the disturbed snow near the cliff face and, thinking it might be a bear den he could take shelter in, began to dig. He was shocked when his hands broke through into open air, and he tumbled into the mouth of Agnes's cave. He found a woman and a small boy, not just surviving, but living. He smelled rabbit stew simmering over a fire. He saw the neatly stacked firewood, the drying pelts, the clean, organized space. And then Agnes led him to the back of the cave. When he saw the small, thriving garden, illuminated by the strange glow of the mica reflectors, he stopped. He, a man who had spent 40 years reading the land, had never seen anything like it. He knelt and touched a carrot top, as if to confirm it was real. He recognized what she had done not as witchcraft, but as a form of genius that was both profoundly practical and deeply mysterious. He did not offer to save her. He saw she was already saved. He asked if he could stay until the storm passed. Agnes agreed. He had knowledge she lacked, how to properly smoke and preserve meat so it would last for months, which winter roots were edible, the best way to track a snowshoe hare. He recognized in her a competence the town had dismissed as hysteria. Theirs was not a partnership of need, but of mutual respect. He never once mentioned Prospect Creek. When the storm broke, Jedediah prepared to leave. Agnes packed him a small bundle of carrots and kale. "For your journey," she said. He took it, and in return, left her a proper skinning knife and a small bag of salt. "Trade," he said. It was a word that changed everything. A week later, he returned. He had taken the vegetables to Sterling's store. Sterling had scoffed, assuming they were from a root cellar, until he tasted the sharp bite of a fresh radish. He offered Jedediah a pittance, but the transaction had been witnessed. The doctor's wife, a woman named Mary, had a daughter sick with a persistent winter cough. The child was pale and weak. Mary saw the fresh greens and a desperate hope bloomed in her. She quietly approached Jedediah later and asked where he had gotten them. He told her the story. He did not embellish. He just stated the facts. The next week, Mary made the difficult journey to the cave herself. She did not come empty-handed. She brought a bottle of potent cough syrup, 2 thick wool blankets, and a small sack of flour. She traded them for a basket of vegetables. She did not ask Agnes how she had done it. She simply said, "Thank you." The conversion of Prospect Creek did not happen in the church or the town hall. It happened quietly, one desperate mother at a time. The preacher, from his pulpit, warned of unnatural harvests and things that grew without the grace of God's Son. But his words rang hollow when Mary's daughter began to recover, her cheeks regaining their color after a week of kale and carrot soup. Hunger and fear are more persuasive than sermons. Soon, others came. A farmer trading cured bacon. A blacksmith trading mended tools. They came for what she produced, not for her. And for Agnes, that was more than enough. The winter did not relent. It tightened its grip, burying the town in snow and stripping away its proud self-reliance. The supplies in Sterling's store dwindled. The salt pork ran out. The flour was rationed. And then the sickness came. Scurvy. An old sailor's disease they had only read about. It began with aching joints and exhaustion, then bleeding gums and teeth that loosened in their sockets. It was a slow, internal rot, a disease of absence. The town doctor, a young man with more book learning than experience, knew the cure was fresh fruits and vegetables, but there were none. The town's root cellars were bare. One afternoon in late February, a shadow fell across the entrance of the cave. 2 figures stood there, dark against the blinding white of the snow. Agnes recognized them immediately. It was Mr. Sterling, and beside him, the Reverend Miller. Sterling was a changed man. He was thinner, his face etched with lines of worry. The arrogant certainty was gone, replaced by a grey, brittle exhaustion. His fine wool coat was frayed at the cuffs. He looked smaller than she remembered. He did not meet her eyes. He looked at the ground, at the walls of the cave, anywhere but at the woman he had cast out. It was the Reverend who spoke first, his voice strained. "Agnes. We need your help." Sterling finally looked up, and the words came out in a rush, devoid of their usual authority. "We have sick children. The doctor says, he says they need fresh greens. We were told you might have some to spare." He did not say please. He could not. But the request was a desperate prayer. Agnes looked past them, out at the unending landscape of snow. She didn't speak of the past. She didn't mention his words to her that day in his office. She didn't ask if he now believed her about the winter. She asked a simple, logistical question, her voice calm and even. "How many are sick?" Sterling, clearly taken aback by the lack of accusation, stammered. "7. 7 children, and more adults falling ill." Agnes turned to Thomas, who stood beside her, no longer a shivering, frail boy, but healthy and strong. "Thomas," she said, "get the large baskets. The ones Jedediah made for us." Her focus was not on justice. It was on the immediate, practical problem. People were sick. She had the medicine. The work was what mattered. As she and Thomas harvested the garden, cutting kale, pulling up carrots and turnips, and gathering bunches of dried herbs, Sterling watched in silence. He saw the neat rows, the ingenious mica reflectors, the shelves carved into the rock holding jars of preserved goods. He saw a world built not just of stone and earth, but of intelligence and foresight. He saw a system that worked, while his had failed. As they loaded the last of the baskets, he reached inside his coat. He pulled out a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn smooth with use. It was David's journal, filled with his drawings of geological formations and his thoughts on mining. She had been forced to leave it behind. This belongs to you," Sterling said, holding it out. His hand trembled slightly. It was not an apology. It was not the words "I was wrong," but it was an admission. It was the return of a stolen piece of her life. It was an act that cost him the last remnant of his pride, and in that moment, it was worth more than any words. Agnes took the book. She held it for a moment, then looked Sterling in the eye. Forgiveness was not a feeling she had to muster. It was a simple, practical fact. She gave him a piece of advice, the same way she would have offered it to Jedediah. "The snow is deep on the North Trail," she said. "Take the creek bed. It's longer, but the wind isn't as sharp." Agnes never left the cave. It had become her home, her laboratory, her legacy. Over the years, with Thomas's help, she expanded it. They carefully dug out new chambers, following the seams of soft earth, creating a network of underground gardens, each with its own specific temperature and humidity. They built a small shelter for goats in a lower chamber, their body heat adding to the warmth of the cave. That winter garden, as it came to be called, became a permanent, vital part of the region's economy. It was no longer a secret refuge, but a celebrated institution. Agnes taught anyone who came to learn her methods, showing them how to read the land, how to work with the earth instead of against it. She died on a cool spring evening, more than 30 years after she first found the cave. She was sitting in a simple chair Thomas had made for her from juniper wood, a bowl of new spring seeds resting in her lap. She was facing her first and most beloved garden plot, the pale green shoots illuminated by the soft light of a lantern. The air smelled of damp earth and the promise of new life. From a deeper chamber, she could hear the sound of her grandchildren laughing. Her face, in the gentle light, was peaceful. She looked like a person who had just finished reading a long and satisfying book. Her legacy was not written in histories or proclaimed in speeches. It was measured in lives saved. During the Great Blizzard of 1888, a storm that devastated the entire territory, it was the food from the winter garden that kept Prospect Creek and the surrounding settlements from starving. The town records, kept by a new generation, show that food from her hillside fed over 200 people that winter alone. Thomas carved her headstone himself, from a piece of limestone taken from the cave. He placed it at the entrance, nestled amongst the junipers. The inscription had only 4 words. She saw the winter. You have been told your observations are wrong. That your quiet, careful noticing of the world is a waste of time, or worse, a failure of faith. You have a gift the world has no category for, and so it calls you a liar or a fool. You are standing outside a sealed door, a fissure in the rock you have been told is worthless. But you feel the warmth coming from it, don't you? A warmth that has nothing to do with them and everything to do with what is true. What are you going to do with that warmth? What garden are you going to plant in the dark? The obsidian stone Agnes held that first day was just a rock warmed by the same earth that would later save her life. The world is full of truths that feel just like that. Quiet, warm, and utterly ignored by the people in charge. We tell the stories of those who listen to them anyway. Subscribe to see the next one.